going to say hi now to Stephen Kinnock, who's coming to our studio. Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP for Aberavon, a member on the Labour side who really wants to see some sort of resolution to this, would like to see some sort of deal put in place, who also, just to sort of cover a bit of ground before we start, Stephen, you believe that a no-deal Brexit could cost thousands of jobs in your constituency alone. Does that mean then you might be prepared to vote with Boris Johnson to avoid that?
Well, evening, John, and thanks very much for raising the prospect of no deal, which I do think would be disastrous for the steel industry. And obviously I have the largest steelworks in the country in my constituency. It's one of the reasons we must, above all, avoid a no deal crash out. Look, I mean, the people who are best placed to decide on whether or not Boris Johnson's proposals are going to work are the European Union, because they decide on what's best in terms of the integrity of the single market, and then the government in Dublin and key stakeholders in Northern Ireland. They've given the proposals a frosty reception. But I think it's really important that we defer to their better judgment. I've been quite taken aback by how many commentators and colleagues who sort of not sitting in a place where they're actually living the Good Friday Agreement, living the fantastic achievement that we had in 1998, but wanting to preserve it. They're the people who are best placed to decide. And I don't think it's right to preempt the formal response from Brussels and Dublin and from Northern Ireland stakeholders. So I'm in a wait-and-see mode, but I am absolutely, as you say, very keen to resolve this by leaving the European Union with a deal respecting the referendum result and indeed the manifesto that I stood on in 2017.
You would be content to see, although I also imagine you don't think this is very likely, a deal to be struck this week between Boris Johnson's side and his negotiators and the European Union, their negotiators and leaders around the 27 members of the European Union. You don't expect that to happen. What you would perhaps be happy to see would be Theresa May's deal put back to the House of Commons and go through, maybe in a new climate. But that's not going to happen either. Well, so how do you think this is going to play out from your point of view?
You say put back, but of course the great tragedy of all of this is that the deal that emerged from the cross-party talks back in May was never put to Parliament. And it's full of concessions to Labour on a customs compromise, on a bill on workers' rights, alignment on environmental and consumer standards, and even for those colleagues who are campaigning for a second referendum, a commitment at committee stage of that bill to put it to whether or not it should be put to a confirmatory public vote.
In that list, there was there, a customs compromise? There was no suggestion of Theresa May's administration agreeing to stay inside the customs union, which is something you wanted to see.
No, the key concession on that was that a proposal would be put to Parliament and Parliament would have the opportunity to vote, to debate on it and vote on it. If you look at the list of 10 concessions, that's one of the most important ones. It also, a very important one in there, is a parliamentary lock. So in the negotiations on the future relationship during the transition period, at key milestones, the government would have to come back to Parliament and consult as that political declaration is turned into an international treaty. So the great tragedy of all of this is Parliament never had the opportunity to vote on all of that, and they are in essence concessions which deliver to Labour's 6 tests. So Labour should have been supporting that.
Okay, Miranda, Henry, and Steve.
But there's a huge problem, isn't there, Stephen? Because that list of concessions which came out of the cross-party talks, the absence of those now, the sidelining of that whole process, is how the government's managed to get the ERG on side and the DUP on side. So in a sense, there's no way that the government can satisfy both your list of demands and those from their right flank. So somebody's got to give ground, and they have not chosen you. So in a sense, you're going to be faced with a very stark choice if it does come back to a vote, because you're not going to get your list.
Well, as with this constant sort of Brexit purgatory that we've been in, it's a catch-22, because by giving ground to the ERG, you make it less likely that you're going to get a deal that goes through the European Union. And we are constantly between a rock and a hard place. Somebody has to compromise here. If the EU does reject the proposals, the fact is that there is a perfectly good deal that has been done, that has concessions to Labour and has been landed with the EU 27. And at some point, a choice is going to have to be made as to whether we take that or we have no deal at all. That has always, in the end, been the binary choice that we're going to have to make, because whatever we vote on in Parliament, it has to be something that the EU has approved. There's no point having indicative votes and the idea I think that Henry mentioned earlier. We can't have an indicative vote on something that hasn't been landed with the EU.
What's your guess, Steve? We might as well guess, pass the time until something happens. What's your guess on where we're going? I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable guess. We don't know, a guess, but we're going to be heading for a deadlock and an extension, and then maybe a general election, where the various offers are just going to be laid out there to the country. A Tory offer, which is essentially vote Tory and it's a no-deal Brexit, and a Labour offer, which says, look, okay, vote Labour, we'll try and get a better deal, then there'll be a referendum, and you'll be arguing with each other about that during the election, never mind the other side, and the Lib Dems with a very clear, hard and Remain position. It's a fair scenario, likely scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, just about every prediction I've made in politics for the last 3 or 4 years has the opposite has happened, John. So it's definitely a mug's game. But I think I can tell you what should happen. What should happen is we should do a deal. And I hope that if we can find a way of making that happen in Parliament, even if not necessarily with the support of the government, but we've seen how backbenchers in Parliament have worked together to take control of the order paper, to put forward new ideas, options and proposals. I hope that we can find a way through this that actually delivers a deal that can be signed off both by the European Union and by Parliament. Because if we have a general election whilst we're still in this state of limbo, the only people that will benefit are the opportunists and the bandwagon jumpers, namely the Liberal Democrats and the Brexit Party, because that general election would just be another referendum in all but name, and that's great for the polarisers, but not for people who are trying to pull the country back together again.
Henry?
I mean, clearly that is one reason you're so determined to strike a deal, is that you are not enamoured by the idea of a second referendum. Electorally, because as John set out, the likeliest scenario is you are going to be running in a general election in Aberavon quite soon on a platform of offering a second referendum to constituents, many of whom voted to leave in 2016. How worried are you by what that does to the size of your Labour majority? I mean, does the Brexit Party surge in your seat, for example?
Well, I think that our current policy of getting a different deal and then campaigning against the deal that we've just negotiated in a referendum, because most of the colleagues who would be leading in those negotiations have said they would campaign for Remain in all circumstances. I genuinely don't think that is a position that adds up. I don't think it passes the doorstep test. It's convoluted and it's contorted. And, I have said previously, I think Labour's ended up with more positions on Brexit than the Kama Sutra. And some of my constituents, I think, agree with me on that. So I think it's a very difficult position to defend on the doorstep. My view would be, yes, negotiate a better deal, but it isn't necessary to put that back. However, if that is what is in our party manifesto, clearly people will be looking at that and voting for the Labour Party or against the Labour Party on that basis.
Steve?
For years now, from the point of view of a position of a voter, at some point I'm going to have to do my job and start, putting X's in boxes. And the running joke about the Labour position is that no one's known what it is. And then finally, when there is a position, you sit there and make it seem like, well, you very much disagree with it. So all of a sudden, like, the validity of knowing what I'd be voting for starts to evaporate. And that is amazing at a time when, we've been through a few years of politics where it should have been the easiest gig to be in opposition. Look what you were in opposition against. And somehow you've managed to infight to the level of keeping it. It's like Agent Smith and Neo. The worse one side gets, the worse the other one gets too.
I believe we should have stuck to our guns. I think we had a clear position in 2017, which is that we respect the result of the referendum, but we would never leave without a deal. We were the leave with a deal party. I think that was clear. I think that helped us in 2017. Unfortunately, since then, we've ended up with the waters being muddied, and it has. I think we have to be honest. I mean, we're not going to be able to resolve this problem unless we correctly identify the cause of it, and that is a kind of lack of clarity, a perceived lack of authenticity around what we actually are standing for. What I would say to colleagues who are campaigning for a second referendum, and I absolutely, I sympathise and understand where they're coming from. In order to get one before a general election, which I think would be preferable to a lot of those who are campaigning for it, we need to have a piece of legislation in Parliament that can be amended to propose that second referendum. So, in fact, there's a clear case for bringing a deal to Parliament so that it could be amended in order to secure that referendum. But I sometimes worry that some of the rhetoric coming from colleagues who are campaigning for a second referendum isn't helping to get a deal so that we can have a piece of legislation that can then be amended, and so we can break out of this purgatory, as I say. So I understand. I think you make a very valid point that people want that clarity, and once. If and when, of course, the manifesto, we have to go through the Article 5 process. So, we can't preempt what's actually in the manifesto. We have the conclusion from party conference. But if that is what is in the manifesto, then, of course, we as Labour MPs and campaigners, we have to put our shoulder to the wheel and campaign on that basis.
Okay, it'd be interesting to hear from Ian Lavery in just a bit after the news, with some of his thoughts on what you are saying there about pushing for a referendum, which is obviously Jeremy Corbyn's position, however reluctantly, just at the moment.